The iron shackles cut into Private Samuel Henderson's wrists as the Union Guards marched him through the gates of Camp Douglas, Illinois, on November 15th, 1862. Behind him, 347 Confederate soldiers shuffled in ragged formation, their grey uniforms torn and stained with the mud of Stone's River, their eyes hollow with the certainty of what awaited them. This moment would shatter every assumption these Southern boys carried about their Northern enemies. The sound of metal gates clanging shut echoed across the November air, sharp as rifle fire. The smell of wood smoke mixed with unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of fear sweat filled Henderson's nostrils. Beneath his bare feet, the frozen Illinois ground felt like walking on broken glass, each step a reminder that he was now 800 miles from the cotton fields of Georgia, deep in enemy territory, where mercy was a luxury no rebel deserved. Camp Douglas stretched before them like a small city of misery. Wooden barracks stood in precise rows, their walls blackened by soot from countless fires. Guard towers loomed at each corner, Union sentries silhouetted against the grey sky with rifles ready. The prisoners had heard the stories during their 3-day train journey north, stories of starvation, beatings, men dying of cold and neglect in Yankee prison camps. Henderson's captain, William Thornton, had whispered the tales during their last night of freedom. They'll work us like slaves, feed us scraps, let disease take what bullets couldn't. What none of them expected was Sergeant Patrick O'Malley. The Irish immigrant stepped forward as the Confederate column halted inside the gates, his blue uniform crisp despite the morning frost. His breath formed small clouds as he addressed the prisoners, but his voice carried no hatred, no triumph. Instead, Henderson heard something that made no sense: concern. "You boys look half frozen," O'Malley announced, his thick Boston accent cutting through the November air. "We'll get you processed, fed, and quartered. But first—" He gestured to a group of Union soldiers emerging from a nearby barracks, carrying steaming tin cups and cloth pouches. "Coffee and tobacco, real coffee, not the chicory slop you've been drinking down south." Henderson's diary, discovered in 1938, during restoration of his family's Georgia farmhouse, captured the moment. November 15th. The Yankees offered us coffee. Real coffee. I thought it was some cruel jest, but the smell. Lord help me, I'd not smelled such sweetness since before Atlanta fell. My hands shook as I took the cup, not from cold alone. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These men had marched into captivity expecting cruelty, prepared for the systematic dehumanization they had witnessed Confederate forces inflict on Union prisoners. Instead, they found themselves clutching warm tin cups, while Union guards distributed precious tobacco, luxuries that the Union naval blockade had made nearly extinct in the Confederacy. Private Joshua Miller from South Carolina wrote to his sister 3 weeks later, "They treat us better than our own officers did in the field. The coffee is real, not roasted corn or rye. They give it freely, without mockery or condition." Coffee held power beyond mere sustenance. In the Confederate Army, soldiers had resorted to brewing substitutes from whatever they could forage: burnt corn kernels, roasted rye, even acorns. The blockade had transformed coffee from a daily comfort into a rare treasure. Union soldiers, by contrast, received 36 pounds of coffee annually as standard ration. When Sergeant O'Malley handed Henderson that first cup, he was offering more than a warm drink. He was demonstrating the abundance that Confederate propaganda claimed the decadent North could never achieve. The tobacco trade proved equally revelatory. In the weeks following their arrival, Henderson witnessed something that contradicted everything he had been told about Yankee character. Union guards routinely shared their tobacco rations with Confederate prisoners, not as payment for labor or information, but as simple human kindness. Corporal James McCarthy from the 69th New York Regiment explained to a group of puzzled rebels, "My brother died at Antietam, but you boys are someone's brothers too. What would you do if your enemies showed you mercy when you expected only suffering?" By December, the informal trading system had evolved into something approaching friendship. Confederate prisoners crafted small wooden pipes and trinkets, offering them to Union guards in exchange for coffee beans and tobacco leaves. The guards accepted these gifts with genuine appreciation, creating bonds that transcended the hatred supposedly dividing North and South. Henderson recorded one particularly striking exchange in his diary. December 8th, Sergeant O'Malley brought me 3 cigars today, not in trade but as gift for my birthday. How did he know? I'd mentioned to Private Walsh that I missed my 21st birthday feast back home. These Yankees remember such things. They treat us as men, not animals. But the most devastating blow to Confederate morale came not from harsh treatment, but from its absence. Every act of unexpected kindness forced these Southern soldiers to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the Yankees could show such humanity to their enemies, what did that say about the cause they had been fighting for? The coffee that warmed their hands was melting their certainty about who deserved to win this war. The aroma of fresh bread drifted from the Union mess hall on December 23, 1862, mingling with the sharp scent of pine needles from the Christmas wreaths adorning Camp Douglas barracks. Private Henderson pressed his face against the frosted window, watching Union soldiers carry steaming platters of roasted beef, potatoes, and vegetables, a feast that would have fed his entire Confederate company for a week. The abundance flowing from Northern supply lines was systematically destroying everything these Southern soldiers believed about their enemy's capacity to wage war. What Henderson witnessed that winter morning challenged the fundamental assumptions of Confederate strategy. The South had entered the war believing the North lacked the agricultural resources and industrial backbone to sustain a prolonged conflict. Southern newspapers had proclaimed that one Confederate soldier could whip 10 Yankees, that Northern factories would collapse under wartime demand, that Yankee resolve would crumble after the first major defeat. Instead, Henderson watched Union guards distribute winter coats, thick wool garments lined with flannel, to Confederate prisoners who had been shivering in threadbare grey uniforms. The quartermaster, Captain John Morrison, explained matter-of-factly that regulations required adequate clothing for all prisoners. "Can't have men dying of cold on our watch," he told Henderson's bunkmate, Corporal William Hayes from Alabama. "Bad for morale, bad for the Union cause." The casual nature of this generosity proved more devastating than any battlefield defeat. These Yankees weren't struggling to equip their own forces, let alone prisoners. They possessed such surplus that keeping enemies warm and fed posed no burden whatsoever. Private Augustus Dugan from the 3rd Georgia Infantry documented the psychological impact in letters that survived the war. December 30th, 1862. "They waste more food in a day than we saw in a month before capture. Not spoiled food, good bread, meat, vegetables thrown away because they cooked too much. The abundance is beyond comprehension. How can we defeat a nation that discards what we would treasure?" The informal trading networks that developed between guards and prisoners revealed the true scope of Northern prosperity. Union soldiers routinely offered coffee beans, tobacco plugs, and even small luxuries like soap and writing paper, not in exchange for information or favours, but simply because they possessed more than they needed. Sergeant O'Malley had begun teaching Henderson to play chess using a carved wooden set, sharing stories of his family's farm in Massachusetts, where coffee arrived monthly by railroad, where tobacco was so plentiful that field hands smoked during their lunch breaks. "In Boston," O'Malley explained during one of their evening games, "my sister works in a textile mill, makes more in a week than most Southern farmers see in a month. That's before the war bonuses." The mathematics of Union industrial capacity became impossible to ignore. Henderson learned that Camp Douglas received supply trains 3 times weekly, massive locomotives pulling dozens of cars loaded with food, clothing, medical supplies, and fuel. Each train carried more goods than most Confederate armies received in a month. The prisoners could hear the whistles echoing across the Illinois prairie, announcing another delivery of Northern abundance. By January, the camp's Confederate population had swelled to over 6,000 men, yet Union logistics handled the expansion without strain. New barracks appeared within days, constructed from lumber that arrived by the trainload. Cooking facilities expanded to accommodate the growing numbers. Medical supplies never ran short. The efficiency contradicted every Confederate assumption about Yankee organizational capability. Humanity through overwhelming strength. The most psychologically damaging revelations came from conversations with Union guards about their home states. Private Thomas Sullivan from New York described factories that operated 24 hours daily, producing uniforms, weapons, and equipment for multiple armies simultaneously. Corporal Michael Murphy from Ohio spoke of farms so productive that grain rotted in storage for lack of transportation capacity. These men weren't boasting. They discussed northern prosperity with the casual indifference of people describing the weather. Henderson's diary entry from January 15, 1863, captured the growing despair among Confederate prisoners. The Yankees speak of their resources as endless. Private Sullivan showed me a newspaper from his hometown. Advertisements for factory workers, promises of steady wages, plenty for all. Meanwhile, our families starve while we fought for what? For the right to remain poor while rich men grew richer? The questioning had begun in earnest. If the North possessed such abundance, such industrial might, such organizational capacity, what justified the Confederate cause? The prisoners had been told they were fighting to preserve Southern civilization against Northern barbarism, yet their captors demonstrated civility, efficiency, and prosperity that made Southern society appear primitive by comparison. The tobacco that Confederate soldiers had once cherished as a symbol of Southern agricultural superiority now arrived daily from Union supply depots. Northern factories had learned to process tobacco more efficiently than Southern plantations. Yankee ingenuity had turned Southern crops into Northern products, distributed by Northern logistics, to feed Northern abundance. What did it mean to fight for a way of life that produced less than the system they opposed? Some prisoners began requesting books, Northern newspapers, magazines, even textbooks about agriculture and industry. They wanted to understand how the Yankees achieved such prosperity. Captain Morrison, recognizing an opportunity, established a small library in one of the barracks. Confederate soldiers who had entered the war believing education was the privilege of elites discovered that Northern common schools had created a literate population capable of operating complex industrial machinery. The knowledge was as devastating as any military defeat. The South had built its society on the assumption that a few educated elites could direct masses of uneducated laborers. The North had bet on widespread education, technological innovation, and industrial development. Standing in that camp library, surrounded by books that explained Northern prosperity, Henderson understood which system would prevail. But the most profound transformation was yet to come, as spring brought news that would force these men to confront the ultimate question about their cause. The telegram crackled through Camp Douglas's telegraph office on May 4, 1863, carrying news that would shatter the last vestiges of Confederate hope among the prisoners. General Lee had won at Chancellorsville, but at a cost that made victory taste like defeat. Stonewall Jackson was dead, struck down by his own men in the confusion of battle. The news would force these captured rebels to confront whether their sacrifice served any purpose beyond prolonging inevitable defeat. Before we continue this story of transformation, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this glimpse into Civil War psychology is drawing you in, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history's most pivotal moments. The sound of weeping echoed through Barrack 7 as Private Henderson read the telegram aloud to his fellow Georgia prisoners. The smell of spring rain through open windows mixed with the salt of tears as grown men mourned not just their fallen general, but the dawning realization that even Confederate victories now came at unsustainable cost. The rough wool of their Union-issued blankets felt suddenly heavier as they processed the implications. If Lee couldn't win decisively with Jackson, how could the Confederacy survive? Sergeant O'Malley found Henderson sitting alone by the barracks window that evening, staring at the Illinois prairie where spring flowers bloomed in abundance. The Union Guard carried 2 steaming cups of coffee and a pouch of Virginia tobacco, ironically tobacco that had likely been grown on Confederate soil before the blockade redirected Southern crops to Northern markets. "Heard about your general," O'Malley said quietly, settling beside the young Georgian. "Brave man by all accounts. Even our officers respected him." Henderson accepted the coffee with trembling hands. The warmth couldn't touch the cold spreading through his chest as he contemplated what Jackson's death meant for the cause he had believed worth dying for. The informal conversations between guards and prisoners had evolved into something approaching philosophical debate. Union soldiers, many of them immigrants who had fought for citizenship and opportunity, spoke with genuine puzzlement about Confederate motivations. Private Timothy O'Brien from Massachusetts asked Henderson directly, "What are you boys really fighting for? You don't own slaves. Hell, most of you probably never seen more than a handful. So why die to protect rich men's property?" The question haunted Henderson because he couldn't answer it satisfactorily anymore. Letters from home, when they arrived through prisoner exchange channels, painted pictures of increasing desperation. His sister wrote that coffee had disappeared entirely from Georgia stores. His mother mentioned eating cornbread made from cob meal because wheat flour cost more than gold. Meanwhile, Henderson ate better as a Union prisoner than he had as a Confederate soldier. Truth written in coffee grounds and kindness. The contrast became unbearable when Union guards shared letters from their own families. Sergeant O'Malley received weekly correspondence from his wife in Boston, describing factory jobs that paid steady wages, schools that taught children to read regardless of their parents' wealth, and shops stocked with goods from around the world. The Northern economy was thriving under wartime production demands, while the Southern economy collapsed under blockade and invasion. Private Michael Brennan from New York showed Henderson a photograph of his family's tenement apartment, modest by Northern standards, but featuring glass windows, gas lighting, and indoor plumbing that surpassed most Southern plantation houses. "My father came from Ireland with nothing," Brennan explained. 10 years later, we live better than kings back in the old country. That's what America means, opportunity for everyone willing to work." The ideological foundations of the Confederacy crumbled under the weight of such evidence. Henderson had been raised believing that slavery was natural, that black people were inferior, that hierarchy and tradition protected civilization from chaos. Yet he watched Union guards treat each other as equals regardless of origin. Irish immigrants working alongside German refugees, former farmers commanding units of college graduates, sergeants who had once been laborers giving orders to lieutenants from wealthy families. Captain Morrison, the camp quartermaster, embodied this northern egalitarianism. The son of a Massachusetts shoemaker, he had earned his commission through competence rather than birth. When Henderson expressed amazement at this social mobility, Morrison smiled and said, "That's why we'll win this war. We use every man's talents regardless of where he came from. You boys waste half your potential by keeping people in their place." News from the front continued to erode Confederate morale throughout the summer. The fall of Vicksburg in July meant the Mississippi River was lost, cutting the Confederacy in half. Gettysburg proved that even Lee couldn't achieve decisive victory on Northern soil. Each defeat arrived at Camp Douglas via telegraph, shared openly with prisoners who had once expected such information to be concealed. The transparency was itself a weapon. Union authorities demonstrated such confidence in ultimate victory that they felt no need to hide military developments. Henderson realized that keeping prisoners informed about Confederate defeats was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda campaign. What crushed Southern morale wasn't just the losses, but understanding why they were inevitable. By August, Henderson was teaching English to recently captured Confederate prisoners, using Northern textbooks that explained industrial processes, agricultural science, and democratic government. The irony wasn't lost on him. A Georgian farm boy was becoming educated through the generosity of his captors, while his homeland schools closed for lack of resources. The tobacco trades had evolved into exchanges of ideas. Confederate prisoners who had once believed in the superiority of Southern civilization found themselves debating Union guards who could cite Shakespeare, discuss scientific advances, and explain complex political theories. These Yankees weren't the ignorant barbarians of Confederate propaganda. They were educated citizens of a society that valued learning and innovation. Private James Walsh from the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry spent evenings teaching Henderson mathematics and basic engineering principles. After the war, Walsh suggested, "You should come north. We'll need men who understand Southern agriculture to help rebuild. No reason this conflict has to end in hatred." The invitation represented something unprecedented in American warfare. Enemies discussing partnership rather than vengeance. But before Henderson could contemplate such possibilities, News would arrive that would force him to choose between loyalty to a dying cause and hope for a different future. The whistle of the westbound train pierced the morning air of April 21st, 1865, as Private Samuel Henderson stood on the platform at Camp Douglas, no longer a prisoner, but not yet free. The smell of coal smoke mixed with fresh Illinois spring air, while beneath his feet, the wooden planks creaked under the weight of 800 Confederate soldiers preparing to return to a homeland that no longer existed. These men faced a choice that would define the next chapter of American history: cling to a defeated cause or embrace the nation that had shown them unexpected mercy. The news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox had reached Camp Douglas 5 days earlier, carried by the same telegraph system that had delivered 3 years of Confederate defeats. But this time, Union Guards had gathered with prisoners to hear the announcement together. Captain Morrison's voice carried no triumph as he read Lincoln's call for reconciliation. "With malice toward none, with charity for all." The words echoed across the camp where former enemies had learned to share coffee and conversation. Henderson clutched a letter from Sergeant O'Malley's wife in Boston, an offer of employment at her brother's textile mill, promising steady wages and housing for any Confederate soldier willing to move north after the war. Similar letters filled the pockets of dozens of prisoners. Union Guards had written to family and friends, vouching for men they had come to know as individuals rather than enemies. The transformation was complete, but its implications terrified the former rebels. Henderson's diary captured the internal struggle. April 21st, 1865. "The war is over, but what am I now? Not Confederate. That nation died with Lee's surrender. Not quite American. How can I claim citizenship in a country I fought to destroy? Yet these Yankees offer friendship where I expected hatred. O'Malley says the future belongs to those willing to build rather than remember." The journey home revealed the scale of Southern devastation. As the train rolled through Tennessee and Georgia, Henderson witnessed a landscape of burned cities, abandoned farms, and broken railroads. Atlanta lay in ruins, its buildings skeletal reminders of Sherman's march. The depot in Macon stood empty, its windows shattered, weeds growing through platform boards that had once bustled with Confederate supply trains. In contrast, every northern city they had passed during their captivity blazed with industrial activity. The psychological impact was overwhelming. The South lay prostrate while the North surged with prosperity. Henderson realized that Reconstruction would mean accepting Northern methods, Northern values, and Northern leadership. The choice was simple: adapt or remain forever impoverished. At his family's farm outside Augusta, Henderson found his worst fears confirmed. His father had died during the winter of 1864, worn down by worry and poor nutrition. His mother and sister survived on charity from neighbors who had little to share. The cotton fields lay fallow, no seed, no tools, no labor to work them. The abundant Georgia farmland that had once supported a comfortable lifestyle now yielded barely enough to prevent starvation. Knowledge became more valuable than cotton. Henderson spent his first weeks home sharing what he had learned during captivity. He taught local farmers about crop rotation techniques discussed with Union Guards from Wisconsin. He explained northern agricultural methods that could restore soil exhausted by decades of cotton monoculture. Most importantly, he spread the message that prosperity required cooperation rather than conflict. The response was mixed. Some neighbors accused him of betraying Southern values by praising Yankee methods. Others, desperate for any hope of recovery, listened eagerly to his descriptions of Northern farming techniques, industrial processes, and educational systems. Henderson found himself becoming an unwitting ambassador for reconciliation, bridging the gap between Southern tradition and Northern innovation. Letters from Camp Douglas continued to arrive throughout 1865. Union Guards shared news of former prisoners who had moved north, accepting jobs in factories, farms, and businesses. Private Timothy Walsh reported that 3 former Confederates were working at his family's lumber mill in Michigan, earning wages that exceeded anything they had known in Georgia. Sergeant O'Malley wrote that his textile mill employed 5 former rebels, men whose Southern courtesy and work ethic impressed Northern supervisors. The coffee that had begun as simple kindness had evolved into economic opportunity. Henderson understood that Reconstruction meant more than rebuilding physical infrastructure. It required reconstructing relationships between former enemies. By 1866, Henderson had made his choice. Using money saved from selling his family's remaining livestock, he purchased a train ticket to Boston. The letter in his pocket from O'Malley's brother-in-law promised employment at a shoe factory, housing in a company boarding house, and evening classes in mathematics and accounting. The opportunity represented everything the New South could become: education, industry, and integration with the broader American economy. The train journey north retraced his route to captivity, but with profoundly different meaning. Instead of a defeated prisoner, Henderson traveled as a voluntary immigrant seeking opportunity in a land that had shown him mercy. The coffee he purchased in the dining car was the same blend he had first tasted at Camp Douglas, bitter and strong, but warming him with memories of unexpected kindness. In Boston, Henderson found himself part of a growing community of former Confederates who had chosen integration over isolation. They gathered in boarding houses and workshops, sharing stories of their transformation while building new lives in northern cities. The men who had once fought to preserve Southern civilization were becoming missionaries for American prosperity. Henderson's final diary entry, written from his Boston boarding house on December 31st, 1866, captured the completeness of his transformation. The year ends with me, a different man than it began. I am no longer Confederate, but fully American. The coffee that first warmed my hands at Camp Douglas now fuels my work in Mr. Sullivan's shoe factory. The kindness shown by enemies has made me a citizen of the nation I once sought to destroy. Perhaps this is what Lincoln meant by charity for all, the chance to become something better than we were. The story of Henderson and thousands like him proved that reconciliation was possible even after the bitterest conflict. The coffee and tobacco shared between enemies had planted seeds of understanding that grew into lasting peace. These former Confederates became advocates for the Union they had once opposed, carrying Northern values back to Southern communities desperate for hope. In the end, America's greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in prison camps where enemies learned to see each other as fellow human beings. The Civil War had ended not just with military defeat, but with ideological transformation. The men who returned to rebuild the South carried with them a profound truth. Prosperity came through unity, not division, through cooperation, not conflict, through the simple recognition that former enemies could become fellow citizens. The last shots of the Civil War were fired in 1865, but the peace was won with coffee cups and tobacco pouches shared between men who chose humanity over hatred.